The courtroom was unnervingly quiet, the kind of silence that pressed against your ears and made every tiny movement feel monumental. I had just taken my seat at the polished oak table, my hands folded neatly on my lap, when the executor lifted the first envelope with a measured precision that made my heart skip. My brother leaned back in his chair, a self-satisfied smirk curling across his face, and I felt the familiar sting of being sidelined, a powerless observer in a room where my voice didn't matter. The lawyer paused mid-sentence, his fingers hovering over the seal, and for the briefest moment, time itself seemed to falter. I noticed a flicker across the assistant's eyes, the subtle, almost imperceptible hesitation that told me something was off. My brother chuckled, low and confident, the sound bouncing arrogantly off the high ceiling. The sound should have startled me, but instead, my instincts sharpened. Something wasn't right. Something in that envelope didn't match the procedure I knew was standard. As the first envelope was opened and the reading commenced, the room seemed to shrink around me. Relatives leaned forward, eyebrows raised, voices suppressed into gasps or murmurs. My brother's laughter grew louder, unchallenged, a soundtrack of triumph I wasn't allowed to share. I stayed still, observing, measuring every glance, every whispered exchange between the lawyer and the clerk. Their subtle nods, the pauses and phrasing, they were telling a story I wasn't yet allowed to voice aloud. The executor's hand trembled ever so slightly as he unfolded the document, and my eyes caught the fine detail that no one else seemed to notice. A date mismatch, a missing signature line, a second envelope lying untouched, its presence only acknowledged by the faint crease along the paper, like it had been waiting, patient for the exact moment to reveal itself. I recognized the subtle tension, the momentary disruption of authority that even my brother's confident smirk could not disguise. As the first envelope was read completely, a silence settled that felt heavier than any laughter. My brother leaned back, smug, confident that the outcome aligned with his expectations. The executor adjusted his glasses, glanced downward at the paperwork, and muttered just enough for me to catch. "This requires verification before we proceed." The words were calm, neutral, professional, yet they carried the weight of inevitability. The second envelope, still sealed, held the unseen leverage, the unknown that would soon tilt the balance. Every movement in the courtroom was magnified, the faint rustle of the paper, the scratch of a pen on the legal pad, the shifting of a chair. My mind cataloged it all. I noticed which relatives were leaning toward my brother, who shared amused glances, who whispered questions to each other. I observed the subtle hierarchy forming in that space, one reinforced by arrogance and blind trust, unaware that the rules of procedure had been quietly subverted. I did not speak. I did not flinch. Instead, I allowed the room to reveal itself, each nuance of control and each flicker of doubt recorded in the corners of my mind. The lawyer's careful phrasing, the clerk's hesitant movements, the brief but telling glance between the executor and a distant cousin, all indicators, all clues that something in this meticulously orchestrated scene was not as it seemed. Then, as my brother leaned in closer, whispering a joke that elicited quiet laughter from those seated nearest him, the second envelope shifted in its resting place. A subtle crease appeared where my fingers could almost feel the pressure through the polished wood of the table. My pulse quickened, not in panic, but in understanding. This was not mere inheritance. This was a game of observation and patience, and I had already begun to play. I kept my composure, but internally, every detail was being cataloged. The exact wording of the muttered verification, the manner in which the executor avoided direct eye contact with me for a fraction of a second, the imperceptible tightening of the clerk's jaw. All of it told a story my brother was too blind to notice. He laughed at the moment, certain of his superiority, while I remained an invisible force, absorbing, calculating, noting every error in protocol, every procedural deviation, every opportunity that would eventually shift power in my favor. By the time the first envelope had been read completely, the weight of silence had become almost tangible. My brother's laugh still echoed in the room, but beneath it an invisible tremor had begun to spread. The second envelope was no longer just a piece of paper, it was the fulcrum upon which authority, dignity, and ultimate control would pivot. My gaze never wavered, my hands remained still, and yet internally I was preparing. Quietly, methodically, with patience as my ally, I began to understand that the room itself had already begun to betray my brother's overconfidence. The executor adjusted the stack of papers, eyes flicking toward me, and for a fleeting second, I caught the weight of recognition, not of my superiority, but of the fact that the procedure was not yet complete. The air was thick with anticipation, unspoken rules, and the tension of what had yet to unfold. That brief pause, so subtle yet so pivotal, was my cue. I had seen the weakness in the system, and it would be my guide as the reading moved forward. And in that suspended moment, I realized the first envelope was just the prelude. The second one, untouched, unassuming, carried the power my brother had underestimated. I had no outward expression, no dramatic gesture, no word to announce it. All I had was observation, patience, and a knowledge that when the moment came, justice would not need to be claimed. It would simply be revealed. The second envelope sat untouched on the mahogany table, its edges crisp, almost daring someone to break the silence. My brother leaned back, smirk still faint, but fading slightly as he noticed the subtle pause in the room. Confidence is brittle in a space governed by procedure, and this setting demanded far more than arrogance. The lawyer's voice remained soft, deliberate. Before we proceed, we need to confirm this authorization. Not loud, not dramatic, but in that room it echoed in my awareness. Everyone else seemed oblivious to the weight of those words. As the reading unfolded, tension thickened like a silent fog. My brother asserted dominance casually, tossing aside minor procedural notes, laughing at the faint hesitations of distant relatives. Yet I catalogued each gesture, the clerk's hand hovering over the files, the slight tremor in a cousin's voice, the way an assistant bent in just enough to whisper instructions. These were not merely actions, they were signals. All documents, each signature, each note in the folder became part of a pattern I was quietly constructing. My brother continued to command the room, confident in his assumed authority, yet his every laugh, every glance revealed cracks I could map. The gaslighting was subtle, almost invisible. "This is stressful for you, isn't it?" someone suggested softly. Another added, "Perhaps you should leave it to someone who knows how these things work." I did not respond. I remained calm, restrained. I let the tension build, letting them display their certainty while I observed, calculated, and retained control internally. The second envelope drew the eyes of many, though they saw only a physical barrier. To me, it contained information my family assumed would be trivial, procedural details they overlooked, the type that could alter perceived authority without them realizing it. Every minor hesitation, every fleeting expression hinted that even their overconfidence could not fully mask recognition of its significance. I noted the clerk's pen hovering over spaces, the way signatures sometimes lingered incomplete. Each motion became meaningful, a slight tilt of the head, the pause of a pen, a whisper exchanged between lawyer and assistant. Time slowed. These small details became loud in my awareness, painting a full map of control, obedience, and potential missteps. My brother's laughter continued, yet the confidence that carried it began to crack under silent scrutiny. By mid-session, I cataloged more than signatures and procedural markers. I observed how the order of document review subtly favored him, how timing of verbal affirmations shifted authority, how minor omissions in consent or acknowledgement could tip balance. These details, mundane to others, were mine to interpret and remember. My calm observation contrasted sharply with his performative dominance. His mistakes became more visible, more consequential in the quiet of legal precision. The room's rhythm became clearer as the minutes passed. My brother spoke over the lawyer again, careless and dismissive, unaware that each comment betrayed assumptions of authority. The lawyer paused, noted, corrected when necessary, and I absorbed it all. Mental notes of errors, of incomplete forms, of administrative missteps. These quiet escalations, unnoticed by many, foreshadowed the reversal that would quietly unfold. Every whisper, all hesitant movements, each procedural hesitation was cataloged, not with judgment, but with precision. I noticed the subtle cues, a clerk glancing up at the lawyer for reassurance, a distant cousin's restless fingers, a hesitant nod that froze just long enough to signal uncertainty. These were faint cracks in the facade of control my brother assumed. My observation was methodical, each data point strengthening the inevitability of authority-based correction. By the end of the session, the room had shifted imperceptibly. My brother remained unaware, confident in a victory that had never truly existed. Orders, signatures, and assumed dominance had been cataloged, analyzed, and mentally prepared for a forthcoming challenge. Injustice had been observed. Silent endurance had built a map of strategy. Procedural details that others ignored, which seemed minor, were quietly becoming instruments of eventual correction. I remained calm, restrained, letting the tension mount while authority and law subtly reasserted themselves in procedural whispers. Confidence based on arrogance had begun to crumble against measured observation. By the conclusion of this segment, the room's balance of power had altered, almost invisibly, setting the stage for the hidden preparation that would follow in Part 3. The seeds of inevitable reversal were sown, and the quiet strategy of patience, observation, and procedural acuity promised a shift my brother could neither anticipate nor prevent. Time in that room seemed to stretch indefinitely, each subtle movement resonating louder in my awareness than any raised voice ever could. My brother continued his overconfident chatter, laughing at what he assumed was his undeniable triumph. Yet my attention was elsewhere. I noted the slight hesitance in the executor's hands as he shuffled the second envelope, a pause so brief it might have gone unnoticed by anyone else, but not me. That moment alone spoke volumes. Confidence is brittle when it depends on assumption rather than fact, and I had already started cataloging the fracture lines in his certainty. I began my preparation in silence, while the family remained engaged in superficial conversation and my brother smirked, convinced of his dominance. I methodically traced the details I had noticed earlier. Every signature on the first envelope, every handwritten note on the margins, every tiny deviation in dates and initials became data points. I created a mental map, observing patterns, cataloging inconsistencies, but without making a single sound or drawing attention. My pen had remained unused, but the mind is a sharper instrument, and every observation became a building block for the coming revelation. The second envelope rested on the mahogany table, untouched, its presence heavier than the words it contained. I could feel the energy shift in the room, though no one else acknowledged it. Each time my brother leaned forward to laugh or gesture grandly, I simply observed, noting the tilt of his head, the subtle twitch in his hands, the way relatives unconsciously mirrored his postures. People think dominance is spoken, displayed loudly, but true power whispers through observation, patience, and preparation. During brief moments when the executor glanced at me, I caught a flicker of acknowledgement in his eyes, imperceptible to the others. That small, almost imperceptible reaction confirmed that my presence and quiet awareness were already starting to matter. He didn't know it yet, but the second envelope's contents were aligned with my observations. The procedural irregularities I had cataloged had already begun tipping the scales. My brother's assumed authority had not accounted for anyone who could see beyond the surface. I requested copies of procedural documents under the guise of curiosity, presenting my questions neutrally, politely, and without confrontation. These were small, seemingly inconsequential actions, but each added to a silent accumulation of factual authority. Legal precedents, notarized signatures, and witness annotations, all elements that could be dismissed by the arrogant or inattentive, were quietly integrated into my mental ledger. Every file, every note, every official stamp became a tool in a strategy no one in the room had yet realized was forming. The room itself became a theater of subtle observation. I memorized where envelopes were placed, which hands hovered uncertainly over documents, how long each relative paused before nodding to my brother's directives. The executor occasionally shuffled papers, unaware that the minor irregularities he assumed insignificant would later validate my claim. My brother's laughter was loud, but it no longer carried authority. It was brittle, and I cataloged that brittleness with methodical precision. Each time the second envelope shifted slightly as the executor adjusted it, my attention sharpened. It was as though the room itself conspired with me, amplifying each micro detail. The document inside was more than a piece of paper. It was a silent arbiter, containing truths my family assumed irrelevant. My role was simple: remain calm, stay unnoticed, and allow these truths to rise to the surface naturally. I noticed the small hesitations in my brother's gestures, subtle cracks in his confidence that no one else acknowledged. He continued speaking, his voice confident, but his movements betrayed a growing uncertainty. I did not respond. I did not comment. I simply cataloged. The silent tension was a living thing, a web of observation that I alone was navigating. I began to anticipate his motions, predicting which document he would reach for next, which line he would glance at, which family member would unconsciously echo his body language. Each prediction proved accurate, reinforcing the quiet authority I had already begun to establish internally. Even the executor's demeanor, which had seemed neutral earlier, subtly shifted when I asked calm, neutral questions about the procedural order. My voice carried no accusation, only curiosity. Yet in the slight pause before he responded, I saw acknowledgement that not all was as it seemed. The second envelope remained untouched, yet it had already begun to influence the atmosphere of the room. I mentally traced the implications of each discrepancy I had observed: missing witness initials, inconsistent dates, subtle notation errors. Alone in my awareness, I calculated the weight of each irregularity in potential legal terms. My brother's arrogance had blinded him to procedural details. He had assumed that loud confidence and familial assertion could override factual authority. I understood that power in this setting belonged not to those who spoke first or loudest, but those who observed, cataloged, and prepared with patience and precision. I took note of the executor's micro-expressions when my brother made a pointed joke at my expense. He did not intervene, but his subtle furrowed brow, his slight hesitation in handling documents, confirmed that he was aware of an irregularity. I did not act. There was no need. True authority, I understood, is procedural. It does not require theatrics or confrontation. By quietly preparing, I had already begun constructing an unassailable position that would unfold in due course. By the end of this segment, the room had shifted imperceptibly. The family continued their social posturing, unaware of the silent force that had begun to realign authority. My brother's laughter continued, but the certainty behind it had eroded ever so slightly. He did not see that the second envelope, resting quietly on the mahogany table, already contained the leverage needed to balance the scales. I remained calm, methodical, and patient. Every observation, every document, every subtle reaction recorded in a mental ledger that would soon guide the next phase of the unfolding narrative. Preparation was methodical. There was no haste, no dramatics, no overt displays. Every action was deliberate, measured, and legally grounded. I had already begun to turn the tide, quietly, invisibly, yet irreversibly. Each step, though small, compounded into a strategic advantage that would later manifest with unmistakable clarity. The second envelope was no longer just paper, it was the embodiment of procedural truth, and through patient observation and precise preparation, I had already aligned myself with its power. In those quiet hours of observation, I felt the subtle satisfaction of knowing that the upcoming confrontation would not rely on argument, loud declarations, or emotional displays. Authority and legality, properly understood and methodically prepared for, were far stronger than the shallow arrogance exhibited by my brother. The stage was set, the pieces moving into position, and all that remained was for the natural course of procedure to reveal what my family had overlooked. The second envelope, once passive, now was a fulcrum of the inevitable balance that patience and preparation alone could achieve. By the conclusion of this phase, I was confident, not in any outward demonstration, but internally. Each minor irregularity noted, each procedural detail cataloged, and every silent observation completed fortified my position. When the time came for the authority to act, the second envelope would reveal the discrepancies my brother had ignored, and the room itself would bear witness to a reversal crafted not through confrontation, but through careful, quiet preparation. My patience had become my power, and every silent action up to this point had been a step toward the inevitable realization of fairness, procedure, and moral victory. The room fell into a different rhythm, almost imperceptibly. The murmurs and subtle shifts that had characterized the reading now paused entirely as the executor, Mr. Langston, lifted his gaze from the paperwork. Something in the second envelope drew his attention, and the faint furrow of his brow suggested recognition. Not surprise, but awareness, an acknowledgement that there was more at play than anyone in the room suspected. My brother's smirk faltered for the first time, a micro-expression that passed almost unnoticed by the relatives focused on their own assumptions. I remained still, calm, absorbing each movement, each tilt of a head, each shuffle of paper, cataloging patterns that would later prove decisive. Mr. Langston's hands moved deliberately, carefully opening the second envelope while maintaining eye contact with the family in the room. The soft sound of paper unfolding filled the temporary silence, accentuating the tension without words. My brother leaned forward, confident in the moment, expecting applause or at least acknowledgement. Instead, his posture stiffened as he noticed the slight pause Mr. Langston took before speaking. That pause held weight. It communicated the recognition of irregularities in the documentation, and subtly, it acknowledged my presence as the rightful observer of these details. I could feel the subtle shift. The air itself seemed to bend around the recognition that control was no longer unilateral. The contents of the envelope were read aloud, but the words were measured, almost ceremonial, detailing specific instructions and stipulations that aligned directly with my father's expressed wishes, yet which had been overlooked or dismissed in my brother's rush to dominate the narrative. He maintained his composure outwardly, but the slight contraction of his jaw betrayed his internal tension. The family, previously eager to side with him, now hesitated, their collective assumptions beginning to crumble. Each clause, each instruction highlighted procedural correctness, reflecting months of oversight and methodical attention that I had silently cataloged. I felt no rush, no need to assert myself verbally. The documents spoke with authority that my brother's arrogance could not contest. As the executor continued, I noticed subtle reactions, a shift in a relative's weight, the blink that lasted longer than expected, the brief exchange of glances between the notary and the assistant. These micro-reactions confirmed the gravity of the moment, the recognition that what had been perceived as trivial procedural details were in fact decisive. My brother attempted a subtle adjustment, reaching for the paper or rearranging his seating, small gestures meant to reclaim perceived control. Each attempt failed to alter the narrative. The authority embedded in the documents, verified by the executor, was unassailable. The quiet dignity of procedure had become the dominant force in the room, and arrogance alone could not prevail against it. I reflected internally on the months of preparation, the silent cataloging, the observations that had gone unnoticed. Every copied document, every cross-referenced note, every subtle consultation I had pursued had converged in this precise moment. The procedural correctness of signatures, notarizations, and acknowledgments, all of it aligned perfectly to expose the gaps my brother had relied upon. No confrontation, no dramatics were necessary. Authority had become my ally, and through meticulous observation and patience, I had ensured it was irrevocable. The shift was complete, not by noise, but by the unassailable clarity of methodical preparation. Finally, Mr. Langston paused, looking directly at my brother, his voice calm but authoritative. "These instructions must be followed as specified," he said, each word deliberate, carrying the weight of legality and procedure. My brother's earlier confidence dissipated. He straightened, then slumped slightly, the tension now visibly etched in his posture. The family observed silently, some nodding subtly, others frozen, unsure of how to reconcile their assumptions with the unfolding reality. I remained composed, my demeanor unchanged, yet internally a quiet satisfaction settled in. This was the moment the preparation had promised. Every detail mattered: the positioning of the envelopes, the order in which documents were verified, the neutral acknowledgement of procedural authority, and the executor's deliberate pacing. Even as my brother attempted to interject or reclaim the narrative, each interruption was calmly and professionally countered with reference to verifiable, documented instructions. The authority had shifted imperceptibly but decisively. My presence, previously ignored, now carried weight not through assertion, but through meticulous, patient observation that had anticipated this very moment. The room's dynamic transformed entirely. What had been assumed to be casual control by my brother now appeared fragile, contingent on the documents he had overlooked. I remained seated, calm, maintaining first-person awareness, absorbing each micro-reaction, each acknowledgement, each subtle nod from the executor that confirmed the procedural supremacy of the written instructions. By the end of this segment, power had shifted, not through confrontation or overt display, but through authority, legality, and the quiet precision of preparation. I did not need to assert myself verbally. The documents and methodical adherence to procedure had done so on my behalf, leaving no room for arrogance to prevail. The room seemed to hold its breath. Each subtle movement, the slight shuffle of a chair, the faint creak of floorboards under a family member's foot, the gentle tap of a pen on the mahogany table was amplified in the tension. Mr. Langston, the executor, held the final envelope with a deliberate calm, his fingers hovering for a moment over the seal before breaking it. The sound was quiet but absolute, a signal that the moment I had meticulously prepared for had arrived. My brother, who had worn a confident smirk throughout the reading, stiffened imperceptibly. The arrogance that had dominated the room only moments ago now seemed brittle, fragile, exposed by the authority of procedure and fact. I remained seated, still, my posture controlled, my mind cataloging every reaction, every flicker of doubt. As he began to read aloud, his tone measured, precise, the room hung on each word. The provisions contained in this envelope, including all amendments and notarized directives, are to be executed exactly as outlined. Any prior assumptions, oral discussions, or interpretations are hereby superseded by these formal instructions. There was no ambiguity, no room for argument, only the undeniable authority of the law. I watched as my brother's hands, previously resting with casual confidence, clenched slightly, the knuckles whitening. The tension in his shoulders betrayed the first cracks of his overconfidence. The contents of the second envelope were methodically revealed: clearly written stipulations, procedural clarifications, and amendments that favored my position while remaining entirely lawful. Every signature, notarization, and initial meticulously aligned with state requirements, leaving no space for challenge. As the executor's eyes flicked briefly toward me, there was an almost imperceptible nod, a quiet acknowledgement that my careful observation, the countless hours spent noting discrepancies, and the methodical gathering of evidence had positioned me perfectly to let truth unfold organically. I did not respond outwardly. My silence was intentional. It conveyed more authority than any outburst ever could. Family members who had once leaned into my brother's confidence now exchanged quick glances. The shift was subtle but undeniable. The balance of power had moved from assumption and intimidation to documented procedure. The control my brother had taken for granted had quietly evaporated. No voice needed to rise, no one shouted or demanded attention. The law, executed correctly, had done its work. I allowed the moment to stretch, letting every micro-reaction around me underscore the subtle victory. Mr. Langston continued, his voice steady. All stipulations outlined herein must be followed precisely. Any deviation would contravene the legal intent of the decedent. There was finality in his tone, and the room seemed to absorb the weight of the statement. I observed the slight twitch of my brother's eye, the brief hesitation before a family member attempted a question and stopped to themselves, realizing that the facts now governed the conversation. The quiet authority of documents and procedure had reshaped the dynamics entirely. My brother's attempts at verbal control faltered under the weight of notarized evidence and the clarity of legal instructions. The confidence he had relied on so heavily was no match for methodical preparation, attention to detail, and adherence to procedure. I reflected internally, this was the power of patience, observation, and meticulous care. No loud confrontation was required, no insult, no dramatic display. Everything unfolded exactly as it should, with precision, clarity, and undeniable authority. Even as Mr. Langston began to gather the envelopes, carefully placing the executed documents back into their protective folders, I continued to observe the small shifts in the room. A cousin, who had once mocked my restraint, now nodded subtly toward me. Another family member's glance conveyed understanding without words. My brother, finally leaning back and letting out a controlled exhale, had absorbed the lesson. Arrogance and assumption hold little power against preparation, legality, and quiet resilience. I allowed myself a measured exhale, internal but resolute. The documents, the procedure, the careful cataloging of inconsistencies, all of it had led to this inevitable, unassailable moment. There was no need for additional assertion. Authority and truth had spoken for themselves. The room, once tense with the possibility of conflict, now carried a calm acknowledgement of order restored. As I stood to leave, my movements slow, deliberate, I felt the weight of silence as my final tool. No triumphal gestures, no harsh words, only the undeniable truth of preparation and integrity. The mahogany table behind me, the second envelope now empty, yet authoritative in its execution, held testament to the meticulous care I had taken. I had orchestrated the reversal without a sound, without raising my voice, using only patience, observation, and adherence to the law. I glanced back once before closing the door. My brother's gaze met mine for a fleeting moment, and I saw in it the quiet understanding that the balance of power had completely shifted. The lesson was absorbed not through confrontation, but through the inevitability of procedure, clarity, and truth. And as the door clicked softly behind me, leaving the room in measured calm, one thought settled with absolute clarity. I didn't have to argue. The documents spoke for me. The victory was quiet, but it was complete. Every subtle action, every carefully noted discrepancy, every moment of patient observation had culminated in a moral and legal triumph that no arrogance could overcome. The power that had seemed absolute in the room, my brother's confidence, the casual dismissal by others, was quietly and irrevocably neutralized. I walked away with the calm assurance of someone who had seen, waited, and acted in alignment with truth and authority. There was no need for theatrics. Everything unfolded exactly as it should have, earned through diligence, patience, and unwavering adherence to procedure.